The discussion of gender identity has increased in recent years. More and more people are starting to consider gender and sex as two separate things, while others believe it is today's youth making it all up because they are snowflakes. For many, this whole gender thing is brand new. But what if I told you there was a genderqueer person that lived during the American Revolution? Today I will be talking about the public universal friend, who was born 24 years before the Declaration of Independence was ratified. Hello, and welcome to the Pride series, where I talk about queer historical figures. Before I talk about public universal friend, I have to talk about another person, who was named Jemima Wilkinson. Wilkinson was born in November 29th, 1752, in Cumberland, Rhode Island. An important thing to note for this time period is that most of the Northeast states in America were run by Puritans, and they were mostly little towns, and their laws were made based off of Puritan doctrine. So if you were someone who didn't want to follow this doctrine, or you broke the Puritan laws and were kicked out of the village you lived in, you could go to Rhode Island for sanctuary. Another group of people who would also go to Rhode Island were people accused of witchcraft and just people who lived in the Northeast that weren't Puritan. So Jemima grew up in this sort of environment. So there was a lot of religious diversity. It was a little bit more of a progressive area compared to other parts of the United States. So this also contributed to how Jemima saw the world. She was born to Quaker parents and was raised as a Quaker. She did not have a formal education, but her parents did teach her, and she was very educated in various religious texts. Along with this education her parents gave her, she started attending meetings of another religious sect called the Evangelicus New Lights. Their main doctrine was a person could achieve their own salvation. And during this time, this was a pretty radical idea. Most people would just listen to what the priest or preacher of their community said they should do to achieve salvation. There were certain religious denominations, like Calvinism, that believed you were already predestined to heaven or hell when you were born. So this was still a pretty new idea that salvation was an individual's responsibility. And these preachings were very influential on Jemima. She was kicked out of the Quaker meetings that her and her family were a part of because it was forbidden for them to go to different religious meetings like she did. And this was very upsetting for her. She was very involved in her religion and she valued it a lot. So to be rejected by the thing she cared most about was very stressful and upsetting. And soon after this, she contracted what we believe now was typhoid fever. It's believed that the outbreak happened in the specific area that she was living in because there was a ship called the Columbus that was holding British prisoners, because this was around the time of the American Revolution. The disease was on the ship and it spread to Jemima's area where she was living. So in October 1776, she got this disease, which was most likely typhus, and she was extremely sick. She had a very intense fever, and she was also almost in like a comatose state. Jemima's family did not expect her to live through this illness, but they were wrong, and soon the fever did break and she started to recover. But something was very off about how she recovered. The person who woke up claimed that Jemima had died and that a new spirit had taken over her body. This person explained that during the fever, Jemima was visited by angels, and they stated to her, "Room, room, room, in the many mansions of eternal glory for thee and for everyone." They then explained to her that another spirit will be taking over her body and that she will die. Now, who was this person who was taking her place? They said their name was Public Universal Friend, or the Friend for short. Now, in a modern perspective, this story might seem odd. It might sound like the Friend was borderline making claims that a lot of cult leaders would make. But back during this time, this was sort of a common thing to happen. There were a lot of other preachers that claimed similar spiritual awakenings that the Friend did. So to us it might seem really strange, but to an audience back then, it was not that out there to hear about a person going through something like this. But what was strange about this specific spiritual awakening was that this person who woke up claims to have no gender. Now, most people in most sources I've seen have put the label of non-binary onto the Friend. I can understand why. The Friend does state that they are neither man or woman, but at the same time, we can never be completely sure because the labels we have now didn't exist back then. So who knows if they would have self-identify as non-binary or not. Another issue I saw throughout research is pronoun usage for them. So a lot of their adversaries would still refer to the Friend as she and as their dead name. And their followers would sometimes refer to them as he. And I've also heard other people use they for them. And I'm just gonna stick with they. I just feel like it's kind of a happy medium. But I did hear various different pronoun uses for the Friend. Now, one thing that really stood out to people about the Friend was the way they dressed. So during this time, which this shouldn't really be shocking to a lot of people, there wasn't really any sort of unisex clothing. There were just strict binaries. There was stuff you wore as a woman and stuff you wore as a man. So the Friend kind of had to take their own twist at it. So they often would wear robes that resembled something a clergyman would wear, so they were more of a masculine fit. But they would also wear women's shoes and also would have long hair. And so they sort of made their own androgynous look, which is pretty cool to me, especially because they were in a society that didn't accommodate for that. They carved out their own way of handling this issue, and this turned a lot of heads. So when the Friend started to preach, there was a lot of attention on them. The Friend was said to preach for 2 hours, maybe even longer. They would be able to say gospel at the top of their head without having any sort of Bible with them as a guide. They favored the book of Revelations, which, if you're not familiar with the Bible, is basically the section in the Bible that talks about how the world will end, the Antichrist, all that jazz. And they mostly would preach about how the second coming was going to happen. So like the second coming of Jesus. And if, again, you're not familiar with, you know, the inner workings of Christian doctrine, basically the second coming of Jesus was the end of the world. And so the Friend was claiming that this was going to happen soon. And they assured the people they were preaching to that if you followed them, they would take you to salvation, aka you go to heaven instead of hell. Another interesting thing about their religious doctrine was that it was open to everyone no matter their sex or their race, which was a big deal back then, and this actually upset some people. A lot of the things that was in their belief system was pretty radical for their time. They encouraged celibacy but didn't require it, whereas most other Christian denominations made it a requirement to the point that some people would be kicked out of their communities for being caught breaking their pledge to celibacy. Along with celibacy, the Friend also created a Sisterhood of Universal Friends, which were a group of women who pledged to celibacy and not getting married. As one would assume, was very strange and not common because women were expected to have that traditional get married and have kids, so it was radical as well. The Friend was also an abolitionist, and during this time period in America, that wasn't a forefront issue. There were definitely people talking about it and advocating for it, but it wasn't as central as it would be the years leading up to the American Civil War. And abolition basically was the belief in abolishing slavery, and this was something that the Friend believed in, to the point that they would ask anyone who joined their ranks to free the people that they had enslaved, if they had any. The Friend was able to gather a decent amount of following, and they called themselves the Society of Universal Friends. Now, the term friend is like a common label for people who practice being a Quaker. Even the name Public Universal Friend, the friend aspect is a reference to Quakerism. One reason that the Friend was able to get a lot of followers is because their doctrine was very similar to the doctrine of the Quakers. They had the similar ideas of anyone can do ministry, men, women, whoever. The idea you couldn't just go through the motions, you had to actually have a personal relationship with God to be able to receive salvation. And the reason this helped them so much was because it drawed in a lot of fellow Quakers that were excommunicated just like the Friend was. So people who were excommunicated but didn't want to give up the faith could go to the Friend. This is also what led them to go to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. During this time, it was a very influential city, and there was also a huge number of Quakers there as well. Unfortunately, they received a lot of backlash and scrutiny in Philly because of their gender and just their unorthodox beliefs. And it got to a point that when they were staying in one of their followers' house, there was an angry mob that came. So the Society of Universal Friends decided to leave, and this time pick a place that is a little bit more secluded. They can kind of do their own thing without being under constant scrutiny or have, other mobs come at them. And the place they picked was actually Frontierland, so there wasn't really anything that'd be around them. It was in western New York State. Sadly, peace did not last forever. A lot of the rich followers of the Friend turned their back on them, and they wanted to make a profit off the land that the Society of Universal Friends were living on. So, a group of them, specifically a judge named William Potter and the Ontario magistrate James Parker, planned to get the Friend arrested for blasphemy. stating that the friend was claiming they were Jesus Christ. Now, there's no clear evidence that the friend ever did believe they were Jesus Christ. Even then, when they were arrested for it and put to trial, the case was dismissed, and the judge stated that blasphemy wasn't an illegal thing. In July of 1819, the friend died, most likely from congestive heart disease. Their followers waited a few days before burying them, and mostly after that, the society fell apart. Although their religion did not last long, they are a reminder that gender has never been as simple as people like to say it is. This was the 17 and 1800s, and there was someone who was neither male or female, and overall lived a pretty stable life, especially considering the times. Public Universal Friend is a reminder that gender queerness isn't a new trend that came out from the internet.